In the summer of 1923, in the rural stretch of Sunfield County, Mississippi, the nights carried a heaviness that seemed stitched into the land itself. The fields lay quiet beneath a wide, watchful moon, and every distant hoofbeat felt like a warning wrapped in darkness. It was here, in a weather-worn cabin at the edge of a cotton field, that a young mother named Sarah Whitfield lived with her 2 children, clinging to the fragile promise of a life carved from soil and endurance. The world outside her door was ruled by men who believed fear was a kind of law, and silence the only language allowed to her people. But within those thin wooden walls, Sarah held a different truth, one shaped by loss, stitched by faith, and sharpened by the quiet resolve of a woman who'd already buried a husband taken by the very men who now rode beneath the moon. Tonight, the land was too still, the air too watchful, and somewhere deep within her chest she sensed that the hour she had feared for years was drifting toward her with the slow certainty of a tide. The night began with a silence so complete it felt unnatural, as though the wind itself had paused to listen. Sarah sat at the small wooden table, her fingers working needle and thread through a torn shirt sleeve, the soft rasp of fabric the only sound in the room. Her children slept nearby, their small bodies curled like question marks beneath a patchwork quilt, unaware of the shadows gathering beyond. Their walls, a single oil lamp glowed beside her, its flame wavering against the drafts that slipped through the chinks in the boards. She paused mid-stitch, sensing a shift in the air, the subtle weight of something approaching, something that did not belong to the natural rhythm of night. The stillness pressed against her skin like a warning, and as she lifted her head, the tiny flame flickered, stretching tall, then shrinking low, as if frightened by something only it could see. Then came the faint hum of tires moving slowly over gravel, a sound so out of place at this hour that her breath halted before she realized it. The lamp trembled beneath her fingertips as she reached to extinguish it, plunging the room into a softer darkness, shaped only by the glow of cooling embers in the hearth. The quiet deepened as she moved toward the window, her bare feet whispering across the floorboards, worn smooth by years of work and prayer. She eased the curtain aside with 2 fingers, and there, sitting just beyond the old fence line, was a vehicle. A black Model T, its headlights dimmed but not dead, its engine resting like a beast preparing to strike. Inside it, 3 silhouettes sat unmoving, carved from shadow, their faces invisible but their intent unmistakable. Sarah felt a tremor rise in her chest, not of fear but of recognition. This was the night she had carried in her bones long before it arrived. Her hand moved instinctively toward them, shotgun leaning beside the door, its wooden stock cool against her palm, its presence a solemn inheritance from the man she once loved. She listened, the soft crunch of boots outside, the faint scrape of metal, the low murmur of voices shaped by hatred and certainty. The moonlight spilled through the window in narrow ribbons, painting her face in pale silver as she steadied her breath, drawing strength from the memory of Elijah's voice, telling her that courage was not the absence of fear, but its reckoning. Behind her, the children stirred in their sleep, unaware that danger rested less than a dozen heartbeats away. Sarah lifted her chin, her spine straightening, as though the night itself were placing a mantle upon her shoulders. Whatever waited beyond the door had come believing she would break, but the darkness had underestimated the quiet, unyielding fire of a mother who had already lost too much to surrender now. The first knock against the door was so soft it might have been mistaken for the shifting of the night wind, but Sarah knew better. It carried an intention that bent the silence, a kind of false politeness that tried to crawl its way into her home before the violence that followed it. She stepped closer, her breath gathered tight in her chest, listening as the wood trembled again beneath a firmer hand. Outside, someone spoke her name with a drawl, drenched in mock courtesy, a voice she recognized from the plantation store. a voice that once told her that a woman alone ought to keep her eyes low and her mouth closed. She could feel the children stirring behind her, their small bodies responding to her tension like birds sensing a storm. The darkness pressed against the windows, thick and certain, as the men outside waited for her fear to answer before she did. The second knock struck harder, a jolt that rattled the hinges and sent dust drifting from the rafters. Sarah kept her place, jaw clenched, heart pounding with a rhythm that reminded her she was still alive, still standing. She knew their pattern, the soft knock to lure, the hard one to warn, the third to break whatever courage the first two had tested. Voices gathered beyond the door, rough, impatient, laced with a hunger for dominance rather than dialogue. Their shadows shifted across the thin curtains, stretched by the moonlight into long, distorted figures that seemed to crawl along the walls. The faint scent of kerosene began to seep beneath the doorframe, its bitterness coiling through the room like a silent promise. Sarah tightened her grip on the shotgun, her breath slow and deliberate, because she understood now that these men had not come to frighten her. They had come to erase her. The third blow wasn't a knock at all, but a kick so forceful it cracked the lower panel, splinters scattering across the floor like tiny shards of fate. The children gasped behind her, and for a moment she felt the fragile weight of their terror pressing into her spine. She turned slightly, her voice low but steady as she whispered their practiced warning, the words she prayed they would never need, but had taught them all the same. She guided them toward the hidden trapdoor Elijah had built years ago, her hands trembling only when she touched their small shoulders. Outside, the men shouted threats wrapped in laughter, believing their cruelty inevitable, their victory already carved into the night. But Sarah felt something rise within her, a fierce resolve born from the memory of loss and the certainty that no fire, no threat, no man who hid behind a hood would claim the last of her family. She lifted the shotgun, anchoring herself to the quiet truth she had carried for years. She would meet whatever darkness came through that door, standing. The door shuddered again beneath another violent strike, the wood groaning as though the house itself were pleading for mercy. Flames from a torch outside cast thin ribbons of orange through the widening cracks, painting jagged patterns across the floorboards like warnings from a world on fire. Sarah lowered herself near the hearth, the shotgun balanced across her knees, her breath threading through the smoke that was beginning to creep under the door in slow, sinister tendrils. She could hear the men shifting their weight, boots grinding into the porch with the confidence of those who believed the night belonged to them. The room around her seemed to shrink, walls tightening as though bracing for impact, but within her chest something expanded, a quiet defiance rising like a tide refusing to retreat. Each heartbeat echoed with the memory of Elijah's final days, the way his silence had been forced upon him, the way his courage had been punished. She would not inherit his fear, she would inherit his fire. Outside, a voice snarled her name, brittle with rage and disbelief that the door still stood, between them and their intent. Another man muttered curses, frustrated by the resistance of simple hinges that were never meant to bear the weight of such hatred. Then came the unmistakable splash of kerosene, hitting the porch boards with a soft, sickening patter that turned Sarah's stomach. The fumes seeped through the cracks, sharp enough to sting her eyes, curling into the room like the breath of a beast, preparing to devour everything she loved. She felt the floor tremble with the men's movements as they stepped back to light the torches, the scrape of a match striking against rough wood, cutting through the night like the blade of an executioner. In that suspended second, before flame met fuel, Sarah whispered a prayer, not for deliverance, but for precision, that her hands would be steady and her courage louder than the fire outside. The first torch exploded into brightness, its roar filling the air as it collided with the drenched railing, sending sparks leaping like wild spirits into the sky. Heat surged through the cracks of the door, the boards swelling and hissing as the fire claimed them inch by inch. Smoke gathered quickly along the ceiling, drifting downward in a thick, suffocating veil that made her lungs burn with every shallow breath. She guided the children into the darkness of the trapdoor, pressing a kiss to each forehead, anchoring them with a promise she couldn't fully speak. The men outside cheered as the flames grew, their triumph rising with the crackling of the wood they believed would become her funeral pyre. But as the fire pushed inward, Sarah rose from her crouch, the shotgun steady in her hands, her silhouette framed by the pulsing glow of destruction. She was no longer simply defending a home, she was guarding the last living proof that cruelty could be met with unbroken will, that a single woman could stand against a night built to consume her. The door finally gave way beneath the weight of hatred, bursting inward with a crack that split the night open like a wound. Smoke rushed into the cabin in thick waves, swallowing the familiar shapes of the room and turning everything into shifting shadows. Through the fiery haze, a hooded figure stepped across the threshold, torch raised high, its flames twisting like a crown of malice above his head. Sarah felt the heat pulse against her skin, her vision blurring at the edges as embers drifted through the air like burning snow. But she did not step back. Her hands tightened around the shotgun, her breath steadied to a single thread, and as the intruder took his second step, she pulled the trigger. The sound erupted through the cabin with a violence that shook the floorboards, and the man collapsed where he stood, his torch rolling from his grasp, setting the curtains ablaze in a burst of frantic light. Shouts erupted outside, sharp with panic, their swagger dissolving beneath the reality that the woman they had come to destroy was willing to meet their fire with thunder. Another shadow moved near the broken doorway, and Sarah reloaded with fingers trembling from smoke rather than fear. Flames crawled along the walls, licking at the beams overhead, filling the air with the bitter scent of burning pine. She could feel the heat wrapping around her, pressing against her back in suffocating waves, but still she took aim. Another figure lunged toward the opening, silhouetted against the blaze, and she fired again, the recoil jolting through her body like a bolt of lightning. A scream tore through the night, swallowed almost instantly by the roar of the growing fire. Outside, the remaining men stumbled backward, their confidence shattered, the certainty of their dominance crumbling beneath the force of a mother's defiance. The room was a furnace now, walls groaning as flames devoured them with relentless hunger, sparks cascading from the ceiling like falling stars. Sarah's lungs burned with each breath, her eyes stinging with smoke, but she knew she had only moments before the fire claimed more than the men outside ever could. She staggered toward the trapdoor, her limbs heavy with exhaustion, and dragged aside the rug covering it. The children's small faces peered up through the darkness, tear-streaked but alive, their fear mingling with a fragile faith that she would not abandon them. She reached down, her voice raw, as she urged them into her arms, lifting them one by one into the choking heat. Behind her a beam cracked and fell, sending a shower of sparks across the floor, urging her forward with deadly insistence. Clutching her children close, Sarah turned toward the back door, her silhouette outlined by the inferno behind her, determined to carry the only things that mattered into the air that still belonged to the living. The back door groaned beneath her weight as she pushed it open, releasing a rush of cooler night air that struck her lungs like a blessing. Outside, the yard shimmered with drifting embers, each one a tiny ghost of the home collapsing behind her. She guided the children toward the old pecan tree at the edge of the field, its broad branches stretching overhead like a sheltering hand against the darkness. The ground was warm beneath her feet, heated by the fire's reach, and ash floated through the air in delicate spirals that settled onto their hair and clothes like a sorrowful snowfall. Sarah knelt beneath the tree, gathering her children into her arms, feeling their small hearts beating wild and fast against her chest. For a moment, the world narrowed to the soft sound of their breaths, mingling with her own, a fragile chorus of survival as the flames behind them roared their defeat. When she lifted her gaze, the house was no longer a home, but a blazing monument to everything they had endured. The roof caved inward with a thunderous crash, sending a pillar of sparks into the night sky that momentarily turned the darkness gold. The fire reflected in her eyes, carving her face into a mask of grief and unyielding resolve. This was the place where Elijah had laughed, where her babies had taken their first steps, where prayers had been whispered into the rafters like sacred offerings. Now it burned in a spectacle meant to erase her, to remind her that power came from fear and fire. Yet as she watched the flames devour the walls built by her own hands, a strange calm settled over her. The men who had lit this blaze had taken her shelter, but not her children, not her will, and not the quiet strength that rose within her like a new dawn waiting beyond the smoke. The fire's light stretched across the field, illuminating the empty road where the men had fled, their cruelty undone by their cowardice. The night insects had fallen silent, replaced by the steady crackle of burning wood and the faint hum of the wind weaving through the surviving trees. Sarah wrapped a scorched blanket around her children, her fingers blistered and trembling, each touch an anchor to the moment she refused to surrender. She looked again at the collapsing structure, its final timbers bowing in surrender, and felt something within her ignite, not despair, but a determination fiercer than the flames that had tried to consume her life. With the Bible still clutched against her chest, edges singed but words untouched, she whispered into the smoky air, a vow that felt older than the land itself. They had tried to burn her from the inside out, but she would rise from these ashes, carrying every truth the fire could not touch. Dawn crept slowly over the horizon, its pale light spilling across the smouldering remains of the cabin like a quiet benediction. The air was thick with the scent of wet ash, and small threads of smoke curled upward from the ruins, dissolving into the morning sky as if carrying the final whispers of the night away. Sarah sat beneath the pecan tree, with Ruth and Daniel curled against her sides, their small bodies heavy with exhausted sleep. Her arms ached from holding them through the long hours, but she kept one hand resting protectively over each child, as though the simple act of touch could shield them from the lingering cruelty of the world. She stared at the blackened skeleton of her home, feeling the weight of the loss settle into her bones with each passing second. But beneath the grief, something steadier pulsed, something unbroken. The fire had taken wood and memory, but not the will that had carried her through the night. The sound of footsteps reached her before she saw anyone, soft at first, cautious, like the land itself had instructed them to tread gently. Sarah lifted her head to see Martha Lewis approaching from the road, the older woman clutching a bucket of water in one hand and a dish rag in the other, her face drawn, tight with sorrow. When Martha caught sight of the ruins, her hand flew to her mouth and she hurried forward, dropping the bucket with a dull thud as she knelt beside Sarah. "Child, Lord, have mercy," she whispered, her voice trembling as she took Sarah's burned hands into her own. Tears brimmed in Martha's eyes as she looked over the sleeping children, their faces smudged with soot, but peaceful in the fragile quiet of morning. "They did this?" she asked, though the answer lay written plainly in the charred wreckage. Sarah nodded, her jaw set in a line that spoke of pain and defiance woven tightly together. "But they didn't take us," she said softly, her voice steady despite the rawness in her throat. Word traveled quickly through the countryside, carried by neighbors who had heard the echoes of gunfire and the roar of flames. One by one, they arrived, men with shovels, women with blankets and bread, children holding jars of salve and handfuls of wildflowers as though beauty itself might help heal the wound carved into their community. They worked in solemn silence, clearing debris from the yard, lifting charred beams, creating space where destruction had once stood unchallenged. Sarah watched them, her heart tightening with each gesture of care, realizing that something greater than her home had survived the night. What stood before her now wasn't simply a gathering of neighbors. It was the stirring of a community refusing to bow. As the sun rose higher, casting warm gold across the ashes, Sarah felt a certainty settle deep within her. They had come to destroy her spirit, but instead they had awakened a force that would not be extinguished. By midday, the ruins had drawn whispers all across Sunfield County, carrying a mixture of awe and fear that moved from porch to porch and field to field with the urgency of a rising storm. Some said she had shot 2 men. Others swore 3 bodies had been dragged away before dawn, hidden beneath the veil of silence the county wore whenever white blood was spilled by black hands. Truth no longer belonged to the facts. It belonged to the shift in the air, to the trembling realization that a woman who should have bowed instead stood taller than men twice her size. When the sheriff finally rode up the road, dust swirling around his boots as he dismounted, he did so with the reluctance of a man stepping into a story larger than his control. His eyes moved over the ashes, over Sarah's blistered hands and soot-streaked face, over the quiet row of neighbors gathered behind her like an unspoken wall. The confidence he carried so easily on ordinary days faltered beneath the weight of their watchful silence. He approached her with authority sharpened into a weapon, his voice dripping with accusation as he announced that serious talk had reached his ears about the killing of white men. Sarah stood her ground, Daniel clinging to her skirt, Ruth tucked close at her side. Her voice, though raw, held a calm that unsettled the sheriff more than any defiance could. She told him plainly what had happened, that men had come to burn her alive, to take her children, to finish what had begun with Elijah's death. She spoke without trembling, without apology, without the fear he expected to see carved into her every word. And for a brief moment, the sheriff's certainty cracked, revealing something cold and shaken beneath. His deputies shifted uneasily, glancing at the neighbors whose quiet presence made the threat of law feel suddenly small. There was no room here for his usual intimidation. The morning had made it clear that the story no longer belonged to him. The sheriff muttered a warning as he mounted his horse, promising he would be watching, though the words sounded thinner than he intended, lost beneath the steady hum of resolve that lingered in the yard. As he rode away, the crowd remained unmoving, their gazes following him until he disappeared down the road like a shadow shrinking in the sun. Only then did Martha step to Sarah's side, her voice low and steady, as she whispered, "They'll come again." Sarah nodded, her eyes fixed on the horizon where smoke still drifted in soft grey ribbons. "Then let them find me ready," she said, her tone neither boastful nor fearful, but carved from the truth of a woman who had already faced the fire and found herself unbroken. In that moment, surrounded by the people who refused to leave her standing alone, she felt the first quiet stirring of something deeper than survival, something like the beginning of a revolution born in the ashes of a single night. The nights that followed settled over the county with a heavier stillness, as though the land itself remembered the fire and waited for what might come next. Sarah slept little, her body resting but her spirit sharpened, listening for every creak in the floorboards and every distant rustle in the trees. In the small shack Martha offered them, she tucked Ruth and Daniel beneath quilts stitched from scraps of burned fabric, each piece a remnant of what they had lost and what they had survived. When the children drifted into sleep, Sarah took her place beside the window, Elijah's shotgun resting across her lap like a silent vow. The moon cast pale beams across the fields, illuminating the scorched outline where her cabin once stood, a dark scar on the land that refused to fade. Fear hovered around her like a persistent shadow, but it no longer ruled her. Instead, it had become something she studied, something she could shape with her will. The courage that filled her now was not loud or reckless. It was steady, patient, forged in the heat of a night meant to break her. Rumors slipped through the county like cold wind under a door. Rumors that the Klan had been gathering again, their humiliation growing into a hunger for revenge. A deacon from a neighboring church arrived one afternoon, his hat in his hands, his voice lowered to a whisper as he spoke of secret meetings and whispered vows. He told her the men who had fallen that night were not drifters or nameless wanderers, but sons of influential families, cousins of officials, men whose deaths demanded repayment from those who believed themselves rightful masters of the land. Sarah listened with her jaw set, her gaze steady, hearing not only the warning but the weight of it. Instead of retreating, she taught her children what she had long kept hidden, how to move through the woods without sound, how to follow the river if the night turned dangerous again, how to protect the small sliver of hope they carried like a lantern against the dark. She did not want them to learn these things, but the world gave her no choice. Survival was no longer a lesson whispered in fear. It was a legacy she was forced to pass on. As days passed, the community rallied around her, with a quiet ferocity that surprised even those who had come to help. Men brought thick planks of pine, women arrived with baskets of food and hands strong from years of labor, and together they rebuilt a small cabin on the very spot where the old one had stood. Each hammer strike echoed like a declaration, each nail driven into the fresh wood a testament to a unity that the fire had awakened. Children carried stones from the yard, turning their work into a game, while their mothers whispered prayers that trembled with both fear and hope. At night, when the stars hung low over the fields, Sarah sat outside the new cabin, her children resting beside her, watching as the wind moved through the trees. She knew the Klan would come again. Hate did not sleep long, but now she understood something they never expected. She was no longer standing alone. And as she looked toward the road that had once delivered death to her doorstep, she whispered into the breeze a quiet, "In challenge, you know where to find me. Come see what still stands." It was near midnight when the first distant echo of hooves rose through the mist, a slow, deliberate rhythm that made the earth seem to shiver beneath its weight. Sarah had been sitting by the window, her hands folded over the shotgun, her breath steady as though she'd been waiting for this sound all her life. The air outside was thick with fog, drifting low across the fields until the land itself looked drowned in pale smoke. She rose without haste, the floorboards whispering beneath her feet as she moved toward the center of the room where Ruth and Daniel slept in a small pallet near the hearth. The moment she touched their shoulders, the children stirred, their eyes opening to the fear they had learned too early, but Sarah's calm steadied them. She pressed a finger to her lips, guiding them into the shadowed corner where she had laid blankets and a jug of water. Her voice a soft thread, soothing the rising storm. Outside, the hooves grew louder, carrying a harsh authority through the night, as 6 mounted riders emerged from the fog, their white robes appearing like twisted phantoms drifting toward the cabin. They carried no torches this time, no boastful flames to declare their presence, only rifles glinting from beneath their coats, and the quiet malice of men who believed subtlety could mask their cruelty. They stopped at the gate, dismounting with slow precision, their boots sinking into the damp earth in a rhythm meant to unsettle. One called her name, his voice rough and hoarse, what little humanity he possessed swallowed by the hatred that shaped his words. He told her she had made her point, that she had shamed them, and that tonight would settle the account. The others laughed in low, broken tones, their cruelty sharpening against the silence. Sarah stepped back from the window, her face carved with resolve, the old lessons of survival and faith threading through her veins like fire. She whispered a prayer that trembled through her hands, not begging for mercy, but asking for clarity, for strength to protect the children who clung to each other in the shadows. Then she reached for the lantern, its small flame glowing with a fragile warmth that flickered across her face. She lifted it high, stepped toward the window, and with a single motion hurled it into the yard where it shattered at the rider's feet. Fire leapt across. The wet grass, the oil she had laid earlier, igniting in a swift, winding blaze that illuminated the fog like a rising serpent of light. Horses reared, men cursed, chaos tearing through the careful menace they had crafted. Sarah took aim and fired, the sound splitting the night, the recoil jolting through her shoulder like thunder. Flames curled upward, casting her in a halo of defiance as she shouted into the chaos that they had come for a woman but met a mother instead. The riders broke, stumbling into the shadows, and the night swallowed their retreat as the fire's glow crowned her victory. When the last echoes of hooves dissolved into the distant trees, the world fell into a silence so deep it felt almost sacred. Sarah stood in the yard, her breath ragged, her arms trembling from the force of the rifle, yet her posture remained unbroken. The fire she had ignited still smouldered in patches across the grass, casting a warm, uneven glow that painted her, silhouette in strokes of weary triumph. Smoke drifted upward in slender spirals, glowing faintly as dawn's earliest light began to seep through the thinning fog. For the first time since the night her home burned, she allowed her knees to soften, the exhaustion of vigilance settling into her bones. Behind her, the cabin door creaked open, and the soft shuffle of small feet crossed the threshold. Ruth and Daniel stepped into the dim light, their faces pale with worry, their eyes reflecting both fear and awe at the mother who stood like a sentinel between them and the world's violence. Ruth reached her first, slipping her small hand into Sarah's without a word, as though anchoring herself to the certainty that her mother had once again held back the darkness. Daniel lingered beside them, clutching the bag of shotgun shells he had guarded through the night, his young face drawn into a seriousness no child should ever wear. Sarah knelt before them, gathering both children into her arms, feeling their warmth press into her chest, as if pulling her back into the realm of the living. "They're gone," she whispered, her voice hoarse but steady. Daniel looked up at her, his brow furrowed with concern as he asked whether she was hurt. Sarah shook her head gently, brushing soot from his cheek with the tenderness of a promise renewed. "Not hurt," she murmured, "just tired. But the world is changing, baby. It has to." She lifted her gaze toward the horizon, where the sky had begun to soften into hues of pale gold, the light touching the scorched earth as though tracing the outline of a new beginning. By mid-morning, neighbors emerged from the woods and down the road, drawn by the rumors that had flown through the county like startled birds. Word spread that the Klan had ridden out again and been driven back once more, not by men, not by rifles raised in groups, but by a single woman who refused to bow. Some came with disbelief, etched across their faces, others with reverence, as though they were approaching the site of a miracle forged in fire and defiance. Martha Lewis arrived first, her steps slow with awe as she took in the sight of the scorched earth and the woman standing firmly at its center. "Lord Almighty, Sarah," she whispered, "you've turned this place upside down." But Sarah only shook her head, her eyes steady as she looked beyond the crowd to the quiet road where the riders had fled. "No," she said softly. "They did that when they came here the first time. I just stopped it from burning again." And in that moment, surrounded by neighbors who watched her with a mixture of pride and trembling hope, Sarah understood that the night had carved something permanent into the county's memory, a truth that could no longer be buried by fear. As the sun climbed higher, The story of the night spread far beyond the boundaries of their small community, carried from field to field by the farmhands, whispered in general stores, murmured along the train platforms in Greenwood. By the third morning, the echoes of her defiance had traveled all the way to the courthouse, stirring the unease of men who relied on silence as a shield. A deputy rode out with an arrest warrant tucked inside his coat, its neatly folded edges hiding the truth of its purpose, to punish courage disguised as survival. When he arrived at Sarah's gate, he found not a lone woman, but a crowd gathered. Around her, their presence forming a living barrier between her and the threat of false law. The deputy barked for her to step forward, but his voice faltered beneath the quiet resolve of the people who had come to stand witness. Martha moved first, her back straight, her eyes sharp with the fierce protection born from community. She challenged his accusations, asking whether defending one's children had become a crime in Sunfield County. And though the deputy attempted to regain his authority, the words clattered from his tongue like stones lacking aim. Sarah stepped forward before anyone else could speak for her, her posture composed, her dress clean, her dignity unshaken, despite the long nights that had carved exhaustion into the corners of her eyes. She told the deputy plainly what she had done, that she had defended her children, her life, and her land. There was no apology in her voice, only truth, carried with the strength of someone who had faced death and refused its claim. The deputy's expression tightened with frustration, for he found no fear to manipulate, no shame to exploit. His threat to keep watch sounded hollow, absorbed into the steadfast silence of those who stood around her. He spat in the dirt near her feet, a gesture meant to insult, yet it only exposed his impotence, for he could not touch the dignity she carried. As he rode away, the murmurs of the crowd rose like a promise, soft, steady, and unyielding, the sound of people realizing they were stronger together than they had ever been alone. That evening, the church bell rang without warning, its clear, urgent toll drawing men, women, and children from their homes. They filled the small chapel by the river, lanterns lining the pews like watchful sentinels. Pastor Rowland stood at the pulpit, Elijah's singed Bible resting in his hands, the scorched edges a testament to a faith that had survived fire itself. His voice trembled as he spoke of Sarah, not praising her as a symbol, but honoring her as a mother who had fought with a courage woven from both desperation and devotion. He told the congregation that the fire meant to destroy her had instead illuminated a truth long buried, that faith was not merely endurance, but action trembling with purpose. Sarah stood in the back, her children beside her, her eyes lowered in humility. She had not sought to become a figure spoken of in sermons. She wanted only to keep her family safe. Yet, as the people around her lifted their voices in a hymn that filled the chapel with a swelling tide of strength, she understood that her stand had become something greater, a spark that had awakened hope in a place long ruled by fear. Weeks slipped past with the slow, steady weight of a world learning to breathe again, yet the memory of the night refused to fade. It lingered in the whispers exchanged over wash lines, in the steady rhythm of hammers rebuilding homes, in the quiet glances shared between neighbors who now walked with their heads held higher than before. Sarah's name traveled far beyond Sunfield County, carried like a hymn on the lips of those who had never met her, but felt strengthened by the story of a mother who had turned terror into testimony. People journeyed from distant towns, not out of curiosity but reverence, bringing jars of preserves, hand-stitched quilts, and letters folded with trembling gratitude. To some, she became a question. How had one woman dared to stand? To others, she became an answer. Courage was not the privilege of men, nor the inheritance of the powerful, but the quiet, unyielding fire of a heart determined to protect what it loved. And though the attention felt strange to her, Sarah received it with grace, understanding that the story no longer belonged solely to her. It had become a lantern for those who still walked through nights colder than her own. The Klan did not vanish in the wake of her defiance, for hatred rarely dissolves simply because it has been challenged. It retreats, festers, and waits. Yet something had changed in Sunfield County, something subtle but unmistakable. Families who had once lived in silence now stood on their porches at dusk with lanterns lit and rifles resting within reach. Men who had bowed their heads in fear now gathered in quiet circles, discussing ways to protect their communities. Even the children sensed the shift, running more boldly through the fields, their laughter carrying a defiant music into the wind. The land itself seemed to remember the stand Sarah had taken, holding the scar of her burned home as a reminder that fire could consume wood, but not will. And through it all, Sarah continued her life with simple steadiness, tending her garden, teaching her children, praying with the same quiet conviction that had held her through the darkest hours of night. She knew the world's cruelty had not been extinguished, but she also knew it no longer moved unchallenged through the county's fields. Years later, when reporters arrived seeking stories of resistance rising from the southern soil, they found Sarah living in the same small cabin built by her neighbors. Her hair had silvered, her hands had softened with age, but her eyes still carried the calm fire of the woman who had stood between death and her children without flinching. One young journalist, barely older than Daniel, had been the night of the fire, asked her where she found the strength to fight back when the world had given her every reason to fold. Sarah looked at him with a faint, thoughtful smile, the kind shaped by years of surviving what others could not comprehend. "Strength?" she said softly. "It wasn't strength. It was love. And love, when it's cornered, don't bow. It learns to fight." The reporter wrote her words down carefully, unaware they would echo across generations, carried in sermons, whispered to daughters, repeated in marches yet to come. For though the flames had long been extinguished, Sarah Whitfield remained what the fire could not consume, a living testament to the power of a single heart set ablaze with purpose, a reminder carved into the history of a land that once tried to silence her, but instead learned her name,